Hello everyone, my name is Vince Hammond. I will be your host for this Introduction to Customizing DraftSight. In this class, we're going to discuss how to modify your custom user interface, create aliases, and also create small Lisp routines that you can use to increase your productivity. Now this module or this first session is a repeat of a webinar that was also available. However, in this class, we're going to go just a little bit deeper than we did in the webinar series. And so you'll see some more examples, and you'll also be able to pause the video and create some of these on your own. Now, this is a 7-series class that we put together. And if you are new to Lisp programming and have never done it before, you might want to start with session 3 to go through that after you've done this course. To go through the basics of how to create Lisp routines, how to create the sequence, the modules, the operators, and all those things that you have to do to create very simple Lisp routines within DraftSight. Now, if you're coming from another CAD system and you want to go through some best practices or things to watch out for in DraftSight, then you can start with session 2 and go through that. Now, throughout the entire series on all the modules, I will point out areas that are similar to other CAD systems and or where things may be manipulated just a little bit different. But for the most part, things that you've done in other CAD systems will translate over easily or very well into DraftSight. So to get started in this class, what we're going to go through is, first of all, going through your options and things that I would point out that are best practices or things that you can change within your options. We'll go through shortcuts, aliases, how those work, how to create your own aliases, and then we'll go into the menu command, the interface, and show how you can set up your toolbars, custom toolbars, and manipulate your menus. I'll go into syntax on how to create special menu commands that you can use in your toolbars, and then I'll talk about the API, some macro things that happen in the API just for your information, and then we'll get into some simple Lisp programs. By the end of this class, you'll be able to write your own single line Lisp routines that you would be able to use either outside of the menu or also inside the menu within a toolbar. So where do we start? My recommendation is, before doing any customization, is to go into the option settings, into your profiles, and create a backup of the current environment or the current profile that's saved. So you may just select add and then create I would call it DraftSight defaults, and then once you're done, you want to do an export and save that out to a location where you can always bring it back in case something goes wrong. Now, the second step would be to create a new profile, give it a name. In my case, maybe I'll call it Vince, or if you could call it your company name. You want to add that, and then once you've created it, you want to activate that so that becomes the current profile where you're making your customization or your current changes. Now, in the options on the left panel, you'll see there's a number of different things. At the very top, probably the most important one to start with is your file locations. And when you select file locations under drawing support, you're going to see that there are different settings for different locations of files. For the drawing template files and also for the title block, these files are located within the app data folder and they're sort of buried down in there. So one of the recommendations I might have is, if you have your own standard library of different templates and or DWT files, template files, or if you have different title blocks and things, I would put them in a place, and I prefer like the users public folder because I have access to that folder. Put it in there and then change these folder locations to point to that new location where you're storing your files. Now, something to keep in mind is, again, where those defaults are being stored. They're currently being stored under your user login name, app data, and then different subdirectories from there on. As you notice, app data is normally hidden by Windows by default. So this oftentimes makes it difficult, if you don't have that folder unhidden, to go find some of your support files or some of your default files. So one of the recommendations I would give you is to change the location of these to something like users public, something that you can get to, something that's not hidden in Windows by default, and point those files there. Now, what I like to do is create a series of subfolders under a DraftSight And you'll notice I use an exclamation point only so that it gets to the top of the list. You'll see I do that a lot. But then it's easy to get to. All my defaults are there, and I can put a subfolder for blocks, maybe my Lisp routines, my templates, title blocks, different things that I might do. And then if you notice in this, and we'll talk about this later, but I've also created what's called a startup.lsp file. This is a Lisp routine or a Lisp file that if DraftSight sees that file within the support folders, it will automatically run and load that file for you. So this is a great place to store some of your default things that you want to have happen during a startup or while opening up a drawing. So if we look at the options still under the file locations, there is a folder called system, and at the very bottom you'll see support file search path. So in here, if you'll notice, what I did is I've added a couple different paths to point to DraftSight, then to DraftSight Lisp, and then to DraftSight blocks. And the way these work in the support folder is when DraftSight goes to look to find either a Lisp routine, if you don't specify exactly where it is in the system, if you just say find and go get this Lisp routine or this block drawing, it will go through these in sequential order to see if it can find that file, and if it can, then it will automatically launch it. So it's really good to know that these files are searched sequentially as they're placed here, and that's why you see over here we have this move up and move down, so that if we select one of those folders, we can change the sequence of how that file is accessed. Now in the options dialog, there are a number of areas that you can go into to customize your settings. Some of these settings are saved in the system in DraftSight, and others are saved in the drawing. Now the file locations, those are system changes. So if we make changes here to those paths, that is going to be global in that it affects all of the paths for DraftSight. But then if we go under system options, also these are global settings where you can change your background, your scroll bars, your pointers, also autosave, whether it's on, off, and the duration. Those things are saved under the system options. If you go under user preferences, you'll see things like your drafting options, your mouse options, and the aliases. And we're going to cover the aliases. That's probably one of the areas that I think don't get covered enough in terms of customization or setup. But then also under drawing settings, you're going to see things that are specific to the drawing that you currently have open, like your scales, units, some of the drawing standards. And then also under drafting styles, these are things that mostly pertain, again, to the drawing that's currently open, which is your dimension styles, your text and font styles, and then table styles, things of that nature. So depending on what you set up in here, some of that stuff will be saved in the drawing. Some of these settings will actually be saved globally. And so once you've made those changes or done anything within there, the next thing I would recommend before you get even deeper is to, again, go back into your profiles on the last section of that interface and go to your current profile, make sure it's active, double check that it says that it's active, and then do an export. And the reason I say this is because as you get into more and more customization and changing things, it's always good to go back in case you do something. I like to experiment, and sometimes I wind up doing something that doesn't quite work right, and it's always good to have a fallback or to go back to a previous version where things were working perfectly fine. So let's talk about those aliases. I showed you where they were. They were under user preferences and aliases, and you'll see that you have an interface where you can display all the commands that are available in DraftSight and all the aliases for those commands. And for this, I'm going to jump over to DraftSight so we can take a look at this. So again, if we go under options, if I type it in, you'll see under my user preferences and my aliases, I have a list of all the commands and all the aliases that exist within a DraftSight. Now, if I click on the top of the command area, it will sort those alphabetically, or if I pick on the aliases area, it will also sort those alphabetically. So it's kind of nice to be able to toggle to go through these. And the reason that's really important is because if you want to create an alias, or you need to bring an alias over from another system, it's good to check to see if it's there or if it exists already in the system. Now, if you're coming from some of the other typical CAD products that you may have used in the past, you'll find that many of those aliases that you're used to or that you've used before are already in here. So oftentimes you don't have to import your PGP file or other things of that nature because for the most part, a lot of those aliases already exist. I'll give you a good example. Now in DraftSight, the command to erase something isn't actually erase, it's delete. And so if I scroll down in here, you'll notice there's no erase command in here when I look at the current commands, especially if I sort by commands. We'll do that. And if I type in an E, it'll automatically go to the E commands, and you'll notice there is not an erase command in here as I scroll through it. You'll see that. But there is an alias for erase, and if I scroll down, you'll see that I've got an erase, which is the command for delete. Now, maybe you want to just have an E for erase, and you want to create that as an alias. Then all you'd have to do is say, I want to create a new alias. The command is going to be delete, and the alias I'm going to use for that is going to be E. Now, something I wanted to point out is that if you bring in import a PGP file from another CAD system, the commands have to match for them to work properly. However, in this case, because there's a alias for delete, if the command is erase, then technically, if I bring in the PGP file, it will work because it recognizes the alias as a command. And so you, in essence, you have an alias of an alias. So just something to be aware of, that by importing certain commands from a PGP file, if the command doesn't exist and the alias doesn't exist, then chances are those aliases, those shortcuts won't work. So that being said, my preference really is to go through, and if you do have a PGP file and you've modified it, I would basically look at just those things that you've added, because I think most of the standard things are going to be here. If it's you just go through those things that you've added to that PGP file, that list should be relatively short, and it might be easier to create those one at a time as new aliases with the correct command within DraftSight. Just a recommendation. So let's go back to the PowerPoint here. And again, when we're talking about creating aliases, you basically create your command and you have your shortcut. Now there's a couple things I want to point out. First is that the alias list is saved in an XML file. And if we go back to our settings in the options and you had all those files, you'll find that one of those folders is pointing to where the XML file is, so you can find that if you really need to look at it that way. But there's some limitations. The great thing about an alias is that you abbreviate the name of the command, or you reduce the commands that you would normally have to type in if they're not in your menu somewhere. However, the thing to keep in mind with aliases is that you cannot include any options, or you can't do any macros with an alias. An alias is nothing more than the keyboard shortcut for that particular command. So there are quite a few limitations. Now, while aliases can reduce the number of keystrokes that you have to type at the keyboard if you like to type your commands, before the end of this session, I think you'll see that I have a better methodology in creating a function which would be that keystroke that you want to use in a Lisp routine, which would actually override an alias. So for instance, if you notice I have the delete in this menu with the alias of E, if I define a function in Lisp as the letter E, the same thing, that will override this alias. So just something also to keep in mind, that sometimes you may create an alias and think that you've created it, but it's being overwritten by something else or some other program, if you're running different Lisp routines or things like that. So a number of things to keep in mind around aliases, but overall, my preference would be to create a Lisp routine to do these shortcuts, because then I can take that Lisp routine with me and I don't have to type any of this in or export or import it to get it to work in my new system and overwrite any of the existing shortcuts that are there. So let's talk about the menu system and the toolbars. Probably the next level of customization, if you have a couple keyboard shortcuts, probably the most popular area to do customization for individuals would be around the toolbars. Now, the most common are, you like to have your commands in certain areas, you like to reorganize them, you like to put them in the commands that you use the most in a special toolbar. That's actually the area that I like to do customization, because I typically, as I'm working on either certain projects or certain types of drawings, I might have a series of commands that I use over and over and over again, and I like to just have those all in one little toolbar, so I have very few things that I have to go search for. So that's probably the number one area, is putting just a custom toolbar together to make sure you can get to your options. So to launch the customization interface, we can simply type CUI at the command line, or we can right click on any toolbar, and you'll notice at the bottom of the menu that shows up, there'll be an option for launching the customization interface. Now, what we're going to focus on here is simply the interface section that allows us to modify, create, and update our toolbars. So when we pick on the toolbar section, you'll notice a drop down. There'll be a list of toolbars, and you can create toolbars in here. In this case, I have my toolbar. And then to add a command to that toolbar, we simply open up the right panel. We find the command that we want. We simply drag it and drop it into the toolbar and apply that change, and it's done. Very simple. Let me show you that works in DraftSight. So if I'm in DraftSight and I go to my menu, just right click on any toolbar, you'll see down here where it says customize interface. Now sometimes it takes a couple seconds for that dialog or this editor to show up, but once it's here, you'll notice I'll go to toolbars, and in here I can scroll down. I have a toolbar called Vince. Also, if I right click, I can create a new toolbar. Very easy to do. But if I have my toolbar called Vince and I want to add a command, I simply toggle the panel on over here, and I can type in the command that I want. In this case, I want the command called options. OPT, there we go. There's options. I can simply drag this and drop it into my toolbar and apply. Now you'll notice I have my toolbar over here, and once I apply, it actually highlights, it updates the toolbar, and then we can say OK. So now that I've placed the options command in my toolbar, I can simply go over to the toolbar, pick that, one click, and there I have my options dialog box. So maybe it's not something you would use all the time, but maybe it's your early stages of customizing or setting things up in your system, and you want to constantly go back to that dialog box or that interface. You can simply add it to the menu, and it's there. And then when you're done using it, if you don't want it anymore, we can go back into the customize interface, and it's very easy to get rid of that toolbar or that toolbar icon. So again, I'll just scroll down to Vince. I can find it. I can drag and drop. I can drag these around. I can change their order. I can simply pick on it. You notice over here is a delete button. I say delete and hit apply, and you'll notice I've removed that function from the menu. Now, the toolbars are really good for a couple different things, but what I really want to talk about is how I can create special commands that I can put into that toolbar. If you noticed, I had a string of different icons in there, and they may not have looked familiar to you because they're a little different. They're not standard, but they're actually custom macros that I can put inside of that toolbar. And that's where it becomes really productive. So for instance, to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the CUI, and then in the first section, we're going to create a custom command. And then with that command, we can then assign that command to the interface. So let me show you how that works. Okay, so we're back in DraftSight, and if I get back into my customization interface, and you will see the command section, then if I want to add a new one, there's the plus symbol over here where I can say add a command, and basically it gives me a new empty command line. I can pick over here where it shows icon. If I double click, here's an entire list of all the available icons. Now you can also go to this interface over here, and you can grab the icons that you want and drag them and drop them in here. For your command string, you can type it in here, and you can basically set up your custom command. But now I've got some already set up that I want to show you. So if I scroll up to the top of the list, and again, you'll notice what I use is an exclamation point so that all of my custom commands are at the top of the list, so I don't have to go through the list to find them. But here's a good example. I have two. I have a fillet 0 and a fillet 1. These are those types of things that I use all the time, especially if I'm doing 3D modeling or other things where I need to keep applying different fillets as I'm going through my design process. So I want to create a series of different fillet shortcuts that I can pick in the menu or in my toolbar that will allow me to quickly toggle between different size fillet radiuses. So here's the command string. You'll notice there's an asterisk and then a caret C, the command, which is called fillet, a semicolon, an R for radius, another semicolon, a 1, and a semicolon. And so what does that do? Basically, the asterisk allows this sequence to repeat, and then the caret C is a double cancel or a double escape. and then I have my command, and then simply like typing at the keyboard, semicolon is the same as hitting the enter key, and then I can type in the options that I need for this command. I can string them all together in a little macro to create these two commands. So how do they work? If I just say OK, and I come back, and in fact we have to have a drawing that has something in it to put a fillet on. So I've got this sample here. So I've got my fillet 0 and my fillet 1. If I pick on my fillet 0 and I pick on this, or if I pick on my fillet 1 and I pick on this, you'll notice that I'm basically just running through those two fillets very quickly, very easy. If I just hit escape, I get out of the command. So it'll continue to repeat as long as I pick those things. So a very short, easy way to create simple macros that sort of streamline your process or your everyday things that you're doing over and over and over again. So again, we do this in the command section. We can put our information in here, and here's a little bit easier to read probably is the sequence of events. Now the double C is the same as hitting escape on the keyboard. Now we can do a couple other things. Once we assign that to the keyboard, we simply drag it over, and oh, I did not show that, so let's just jump back here real quick to show you that once I've created the commands, those special custom commands, if I go into my interface and my toolbars, again we'll scroll down to my Vince toolbar here, when I pick on this, you'll see over here are all those custom commands that I created. They will be listed in that list of all the available commands. So once you set them up as commands, and then you come back down into the interface and you can drag them in. Now something I will point out here that I've noticed is sometimes if you go and create a bunch of commands, you may want to apply those, say OK, and then close this interface and then come back in before you drag and drop them into the toolbar. Sometimes it just helps to make sure those things get saved properly. I would just recommend that, just so that you do get those stored correctly into the database. So let's talk about some of the different types of commands that you might be able to use. Now, here's another example. In this case, I use, instead of the ~C or the double escape or double cancel, I'm using a apostrophe. And if we use an apostrophe before the command, it can be what's called a transparent command. That means you can run that command inside of another command. Now that's only available for those commands that follow that allow for that type of sequence, like a zoom, or sometimes you can do things like a zoom or a pan or orbits, things like that that you can do while you're inside of another command. So how does that work? By putting that asterisk in there, if I'm in my drawing and I want to draw a line from somewhere, let's say I'm drawing it from the center here and I want to go up and I just want to zoom to the extent of the drawing, I have my shortcut down here, which is my zoom. It zooms the extent of the drawing and then back a little bit and then gives me the ability to continue the command. Notice I was still in the line command when it did that. So that's what's called a transparent command. It's being able to do something inside or while another command is active without canceling that command and going through that sequence. So let's talk about all the syntax that you can use within a menu macro. So you can use a space, which is the same as a space or the key, enter on the keyboard. My preference, though, is to use the semicolon that you saw in my syntax. And the reason for that is if I have to do multiple spaces, sometimes you have to hit the enter key twice or a space twice to get to the next option or through the next option. You can't really see that easily within the text. And so if I put in 2 semicolons, then I know for sure that I'm doing the enter key twice for that macro. So you can use a space, but my preference is to use a semicolon, as you saw before. Now with a macro, we can pause and wait for the user to pick a point or to pick a location or hit something. And so we can use the backslash. We use the backslash as the pause to wait for that input. Now, because the backslash is used for input, you can imagine we cannot use it as a delimiter for Let's say we wanted to locate a block in a certain file folder and we wanted to put the whole path in there. Well, if we're going to use the whole path as a delimiter, what we need to use is a forward slash for the path delimiter. And I'll give you an example of that later. I'll show you a case where we need to use the forward slash, not the backslash, for defining a path. We can use an @ symbol to define the last point picked, so that if, let's say I'm picking and moving something from one point to another and I want to just use that last point that was picked to do something else, I can use an @ symbol. We've already talked about this one. The apostrophe is the transparent. We can use it for zoom and pan, things like that. The double C, the double escape. Now, the reason we have the double escape is because there are certain modes that you may not be aware of that you can go into where it actually takes two cancels to get out of the mode and out of the command. Let me give you an example. So if I'm in DraftSight and I want to do dimensions, if I type in dim and hit enter, let me try that again. I'll type in dim and hit enter. You'll notice my prompt changes and I'm in a dimensioning mode. So now that I'm in that dimensioning mode, if I do, let's say, a linear dimension, and I can type in linear, and it will ask me for a point and another point, and I'm in my dimension, you'll notice that for me to get out of this command to do something else, I have to hit the escape twice. So if I hit the escape once while I'm in that command, you'll notice I'm still in the dimensioning mode. So if I hit it again, I'll get back to the standard command prompt. So by using a "C," that ensures that we can get out of any modes and commands and get to a clean command line to run our next command. So that's why you'll see that the double escape or "C" is there twice. Also, you noticed when I did the fillet command, I put an asterisk in front of it. The asterisk means take the entire macro and just continue to repeat it until you either pick on another command that cancels it or you hit escape. So that's really good for things like, for instance, my fillet command, where I just want to keep placing fillets over and over and over again. I don't have to hit enter to bring the command up. It's constantly coming back, asking for points while it's going through that process. Now, one of the limitations to menu macros, as you might imagine, is the pause for user input is very specific in that if I try to run a command like a move and I want to select a specific number of items, I'm not able to do that because pause only lets me pick one time and then it moves on. So to do something like a move or copy, or where we want to grab a selection set, we have to use a command called select. And the way we do that is we use a "C," we use the select semicolon, and then the backslash is that pause for the select. Now what's unique about select is select will stay in the mode of picking objects until you hit enter, and then it will continue on. So now in DraftSight, we have to, in the select mode, we have to hit the shift key if we want to select multiple objects, but we can do that using the select command and then move on with using the previous selection set as our group. Let me show you an example of that. For instance, let's say I wanted to move some objects. I just want to nudge them over, let's say 5 units or 5 millimeters to the right. Well, in this sequence that I show you here, we can use an asterisk to repeat the sequence. We can use our select command with the semicolon. We use a backslash for the pause for user input. So we'll stay there in that select mode until you hit enter. And then we'll go to move, semicolon. We have to hit P for previous, semicolon, and then we're still selecting objects. If you think about the way move works, you still need one more enter. And this is a good example where I like to use the semicolons instead of the spaces, because it's easy to tell that I'm hitting enter twice here. And then I'm going to use the 0, 0 as my insertion point, or my first point, and then @5, 0 as my second point. So let's jump over to DraftSight and I'll show you how this macro works. First thing I want to do though is these blue circles are probably really hard to see for you guys. So here's my shortcut, E for erase. Grab these, hit enter, and let's just get rid of them. Well, I've got these two commands over here, my nudge, which is nudging 5 to the right or nudging 5 to the left. It's either a +5 or a -5. So if I pick this command, you'll notice I'm in the select entities. Now if I just pick one at a time, you'll notice it just toggles between the entities, but if I hold my shift key down, I can pick multiple entities, and I'm still in that select mode until I hit enter. Now, once I hit enter, it moves those objects to the right. Now, no, I didn't notice this, but there was actually a duplicate object underneath that other circle. But if I keep hitting enter, you'll notice it just keeps moving those objects. Now, if I go back to my nudge command, and let's go ahead and nudge this one, hit enter, move him over, and if I come into my select objects and I hit my shift key and I pick this one, and this one, and enter, you notice I can move those over. So very easy to create a command to nudge objects over and over by just repeating that sequence of events or a sequence of commands. So let's talk about some more examples. I've got a couple of them that I use in my menus or to create little shortcuts that I think are really, really good, easy tips or shortcuts to use. Now, the first one, you saw this one before, the zoom extents. Now, the other reason I do a zoom extents and then back up just a little bit with the 0.9x is sometimes I get drawings from someone and I go to zoom to the extents of the objects that are in the drawing, and there's a tiny little macro line that's 1 pixel and it's off in outer space, and I don't really get to see much. And so by zooming back just a little, or that zoom 9x, sometimes that pixel will come off the edge of the display and I'll be able to see it in the screen. So that's one of the little tricks that I use. 0.9x is a number I like, but you can certainly play around with that in terms of your zoom, and depends also on your graphics display and your resolution. Another favorite of mine that is really useful is, especially when I get drawings from other folks that don't have my common layers in them, I just want to be able to pick a quick button that creates all my common layers or the layers that I like to use over and over again. So here's an example of a macro that goes through the sequence. First, it does a cancel. Now, I'll show you something here. It's using the minus layer command. By using minus layer, we get the options at the command line rather than the dialog interface that would show up. So we use layer, enter, and then we're going to use the M for make. We're going to use the name of the layer that we want, which is 1. The color is going to be the next option, which is also 1. And then if you type in minus layer at the keyboard and you go through the sequence, you'll notice that after you specify the color, it's going to ask you for the name of the layer to assign to the color you've just selected. So you have to type that name twice. And then once you're done with that, you're still in the layer command, and so you can continue to make layers. So if you'll notice, I can go making a layer 1, color 1, assign it to layer 1, make layer 2, color 2, assign it to layer 2. And then when I'm done with the layers and I want to get out of the layer command, 2 enters there to get out of it. So you can actually string a whole sequence of layers, and I've got an example I could show you that's a little bit more sophisticated than that, but certainly an example of how you can make a single line command macro to just enter a whole bunch of layers into your drawing. Another favorite of mine is being able to quickly set my favorite snap mode or entity snap mode in the drawing. So for instance, maybe I'm doing something where I just want to pick quadrants or center points, or something where I've set my eSnap mode to be only a specific object selection type, and I want to come back to my favorite setting. What I can do is use the set eSnap mode or OS mode, and then use the number to create my favorite setting. Now notice I can also do this transparently. That means I could be in the middle of doing a move or drawing lines, arcs, circles, and go over to my icon, pick on it, and set my snap mode while I'm in the middle of that command. So something kind of powerful. Now, how do you know what the number is? Let me show you this quickly in DraftSight. If I go into eSnap and I hit enter, I should get the interface. And you'll notice right now I've got a number of things set up. Now, if I have when I make my selection, it doesn't tell me here in the interface, but if I turn on, let's say I turn on that I want to see tangencies and perpendicular snaps in addition to all the other ones that I have set, and I apply that, when I come back out, if I type OS mode, it'll show me that that number of my setting is 503. If I go back into my eSnaps and I turn these tangent and perpendicular off and say OK, and I go back to typing in OS mode, notice that mode is 119. So just a good example of being able to recover or reset those favorite snap modes, especially when you're turning these things on and off. It's really nice to be able to just jump back to that setting in one pick, and or to be able to do it while you're inside of another command. Now you saw this one, the fillet being able to do one with a radius of 0 and also maybe a radius of 1, 2, 3. I'll show you some other shortcuts for that, as I've got some other options for that as well. Another one that I run into is the UCS icon, the little icon that's in the corner of the screen. You know, in 3D, I like to have that icon on so I can see where's X, Y, and Z pointing. But in 2D drawings, and sometimes it just gets in my way. So what I like to do with this is, notice over here I've got two little shortcuts. One is to turn my icon on, one is to, right below it, to turn it off. So if I wind up coming into a drawing where, you know, I just don't want to see the icon, I can quickly turn it off. It's one pick, it's gone. But now if I jump into a 3D drawing and I don't have it on, I can simply turn it on. So that's one of those things I like to have, because, you know, it's these types of settings or these types of things that are in the drawing that sometimes, you know, it just takes a couple minutes to set these up, but it's really nice to have a shortcut to quickly toggle on off between those. Now, the other one I like to do, especially if I'm doing 3D work, is sometimes I like to quickly toggle between different shade modes, and sometimes I like to set these things up where you can turn on your UCS icon, you can turn on your shade mode. There's no reason why you can't string a lot of these things together to make a whole sequence of events. And also the last one I have here is sometimes you just want to string together those set var variables or certain variables that are your common settings that you notice are not in drawings that you're getting from other folks, and you just want to have a button to quickly string all those things together and set the drawing up. So what else? Let's talk about the API and macros. I know this comes up, and oftentimes people think of macros. Now, what I've showed you all up to this point have been what I call menu macros, but there's also something called the API macro, and I think it's important that I explain to you what that is and what that does. In fact, if you go into DraftSight and you're under Manage, you're going to see that there's a macro record and a stop button. So what happens when you go through that sequence? Well, if we look at the options menu under the system options, there's going to be a setting for language. Now, depending on what the setting is here, when you go to record your macro, it will record the steps and give you the sequence in the native language that you have here. So, for instance, if you're really up on programming in C# or C++, or if you write applications in .NET and you want to run a sequence of events and understand what the commands that are being used and the order of those things are, this is a great way to record a macro, go back and look in those languages to see how that is being done. Now, you'll notice that there's no play button here. So this is not a macro recording like you would have in an Excel spreadsheet, where you can say, I want to record this sequence of events and then replay that sequence of events on this piece of data. You cannot do that in this situation. Now, if you need to do something like that, there's other ways we can do that by recording different types of steps, or setting up what we call scripts. And I'll go through this in a later session in detail on how you can do those types of things. But here I wanted just to point this out, that this macro recording is not recording steps that we can use in a menu or in some other sequence. Now, if you are familiar with programming in .NET or C++ or C#, this is a great tool to use to sort of get those command sequences down. However, if you have not programmed in those languages and you're looking to do some things that are just taking the macro language that I've shown you just a little bit further, Lisp is a great tool to be able to get you into programming with just a little bit more sophistication, and to be able to do actually much more sophisticated things in terms of your drawing and automation. But I did want to bring this up. I often get asked why Lisp compared to other languages like .NET. You know, .NET is very popular. And so I've often had conversations with folks that are very verbose in .NET, and what I wanted to show was an example of a simple command that has been created in .NET language to do a sequence of two events. I want to do a copy and a rotate of the group of objects, and I want to string them together to make it look like it's a one command. Now, The process to do that and the sequence to do that looks like this. This is a .NET program, and you can see it's a, I don't know, it's a couple hundred lines long, but you'll notice that this .NET program, if you look really closely, you'll notice that this program will not work in DraftSight, and there's probably a really good reason for that, is because the libraries that need to be loaded for this .NET program to work aren't necessarily available. So when we look at something like this and just doing a simple copy and rotate and what it takes to do that, since I'm not a .NET programmer, this sort of looks a little bit foreign to me, and it looks like a lot of work to do a simple command. The reason I show you this is because this is one of my favorite examples of where a menu macro can actually be way more powerful than a .NET program. So if I get rid of this here, let me just show you. Here is the sequence that I would use as a single line menu macro to do exactly what that .NET program attempts to do. Now there's a big difference between these, and that is that by using the native commands in DraftSight, we visually get to see the objects as we're placing them dynamically on the screen, where that menu, that .NET program actually doesn't show us the objects being moved around. So let me walk you through this sequence because I think it's interesting and it might be one you find useful, but it's just another example that I like to use to combat, why I might not want to use a .NET program. So first I'll show you this in the menu macro language that we've talked about, and then I'll show you what it looks like as a Lisp routine. So the first thing we're going to do, as you remember, we're going to use an asterisk, Control-C to repeat the sequence. We're going to use select. We're going to grab a selection set. We're going to copy. We're going to copy the previous objects, and then what we're going to do here, and this is a little trick that I use also, is I'm going to copy the previous selection set at the same location. I'm going to copy it over the top of itself, and then after I've done that, I'm going to move the previous objects away, and then I have a first point, a second point. I'm going to rotate the previous objects, and I'm going to rotate them at the last point that I picked. Now you might say, well, why would I do this? Because if I have a group of objects and I go to copy them, the end result is not going to be a group of objects, but it'll be a bunch of individual objects. So if I go to, say, grab the last object, it won't grab the whole group. It'll only grab the last one. So if I had 10 things selected, I'll only get one when I go to move the last object. Where if I use this method here by creating a copy over itself, then I'm moving away the previous objects, I can move away that entire group. So it's just a little trick I use, but let's see, how does that work? So let's go back to our other test drawing, and I've got my move, copy, rotate here. And in this case, I'm just going to select my objects by using a crossing window. I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to pick a point. When I pick that point, once I place the object, you'll notice that that point becomes my rotation point for that group that I've just selected. And so if I do that, I can come back and do it again and hit enter, grab a point, and move these over here. And you get to see that point that I picked, that point that I picked winds up becoming the rotation point. So there it is, a command, very dynamic. I can see as I move my objects around. It's not a good example, but you can see that as I move my objects around, I can dynamically see that. And it goes right back into looking for more objects to do the sequence again. So I think of, if I'm doing architecture and I've got a bunch of desks and chairs to move around, I can simply copy them, move them, rotate them in place, put them in place. This one little macro can save me tons of time because it's just simply picking the objects and moving them. It's really sort of a kind of a cool way to do it. So what does this macro look like as a Lisp routine? Well, actually, it is also a single line of code, not 200 lines of code like we'd have to do in .NET. And because, again, it's also using the native commands, it's going to have the same behavior that we have with that macro. So a little different in Lisp, we use an open parenthesis in Lisp. In fact, everything in Lisp is parentheses, and you'll get to learn that later. But notice we use something called a command, which is going to say what is the command, or what are the things that we're going to send to the command line. In this case, we're going to send strings to the command line. For instance, we're going to send the command select, and then we're going to use a pause. So instead of a backslash, we use the word pause. And then all the commands we use are strings, and so we have to encapsulate them in quotes. So we have the copy command, the P for previous, an enter. We have our 2 points or 0, 0, 0, 0, our move, our previous, pause, pause, rotate. Basically the same sequence, just a little different syntax. Now, what's really cool about Lisp is with Lisp, I can define my own commands or my own, we'll call them aliases like we showed earlier, but they can be much more powerful. So what would it look like to create a command called CR in Lisp? Well, this is it. It's basically 4 lines, if you want to count this as a line, 4 lines of code. So the 3 commands we're going to use here in Lisp, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a function. Defun is the command, open parenthesis, define function. C colon means this is a command. So a command that we would type at the keyboard. In this case, we're going to make a command called CR. Now, the next set of parentheses are for declaring variables. We have no variables here. It's just simply a command, so we don't have anything to declare. And we just run this exact sequence that we have here. And at the end, we do a print C with a start a new line and say done. All this does is cleans up the end of the command or the program so that it doesn't give us this little nil that we can see at the end of a Lisp routine that says I'm all done. So it's just a little, we'll call this a cleanup. So that's it. Now, if you take this sequence and you put it in your startup.lisp, in fact, if I have an example of it here, for looking at it here in Notepad++, if I look at my startup, it is simply this. Now, you'll notice it the way it looks in Notepad++, I get color coding, and that's something I really like with this editor. Again, this is a free editor. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but you know, this is what it looks like. And so what happens is whenever I start a drawing, because it's in my startup.lisp routine, that program is automatically available to me inside the drawing. So if I just type in CR and I hit enter, and oops, I'm sorry, I have to not be at a command. If I type CR, I can pick my objects again, pick my start point. Here it is. But it's the exact same sequence that we did in the menu macro. It's just now I've created an alias or a shortcut called CR that does copy rotate. So very powerful to look at these types of Lisp routines and things that you can do. But you can easily make one-line Lisp routines to do something like this. So what's the difference between using a menu command or using a Lisp routine? So in the menu command, we can pause, but we can only pause for that point where I'm picking or selecting. It's just a pause in the sequence of events. I really can't do anything other than that pause. Where in a Lisp routine, I'm using pause there, but we can actually pause within the middle of a command to grab information. I can grab data, I can grab variables, I can grab numbers, I can grab strings. So I've got a lot of different things I can do inside a Lisp routine that I cannot do in a menu command. So in a menu command, there is a limit. I can only put so many things together. You can try to sequence some things together, but there will be a limit in terms of characters on how long that macro can get. Where in a Lisp routine, I have no limit to the number of commands that I can string together and or the length of how long I can create a Lisp routine. I've built Lisp routines that are 30, 40,000 lines long, not a problem, and they'll continue to work through different sequences or different things, not an issue. A menu macro can't do that. Now, with a menu macro, I cannot do any kind of calculation. I can't take any values or variables or do something, calculate a value, and then give a result. Now I can if I use Lisp inside the macro, but in a Lisp routine, I have unlimited ability to calculate, to do calculations with numbers and values and things like that. Now in a menu macro, I cannot prompt the user for an interface or a dialogue and say, give me this information, and then I'll continue on with that sequence of events. Where in a Lisp routine, I can create a dialog box, I can create an interface, I can ask for different questions, things of that nature. Now in a menu command, it's sequential. I cannot stop if there's a problem, if there's an error. If something breaks, it basically breaks. Where in Lisp, I can actually create different error traps that say, well, if this blows up or something doesn't work, if an error is caused because the user does something wrong, go ahead and reset my variables that I had before I started that sequence of events. So there's things you can do in Lisp in terms of error trapping. And like I said, menu macros are sequential. They're not conditional. I can do a sequence of events, but I can't say if the value is this, do this event over here or do this other event over there. And so you've got a lot of different flexibility inside of a Lisp routine that you do not have inside of a menu macro. Another example is a lot of times I might say if a block already exists in a drawing, do this sequence of events, but if it doesn't, go and get this block from this location, or depending on the values that are presented, whether I'm in an imperial or metric drawing, I may go get a different type of a block depending on the situation. So those are, again, things I can do in Lisp that I just cannot do in a menu macro. Now, menu macros, they seem very easy, but they can be very cumbersome at times. My recommendation is when you get to the point where you're creating macros, write down your steps one at a time, do it manually at the keyboard, and then try to replicate exactly those keystrokes as you create the macro. They can be cumbersome, especially when you get into really lengthy ones where you're trying to, let's say I want to create a bunch of layers, 20 or 30 layers. That macro could be very cumbersome because if I'm off by one keystroke, one semicolon somewhere, I'm not going to know where the event is happening, or it's going to be hard to sort of figure that out. And it's, going to be troublesome. Where if I'm doing that in Lisp, I can create different test loops. I can check my functions, the values of those things, and I can relaunch. Different things I can do in Lisp that I really can't do in a macro. Now, there is one thing that neither Lisp or a menu macro can do, and that is neither one of these programs or macros can open a drawing and then continue to do a series of commands inside of that new drawing. Because when you go into a brand new drawing session in DraftSight or other CAD programs, it's the same thing. When you go into a brand new drawing session, all of the Lisp data, that is all the variables, all the values, all the things that currently exist, all get flushed out and they all go away. And with a menu macro, it's pretty much the same thing. I can open a drawing with Lisp or a menu, but once I open that drawing, I really can't do anything inside of that drawing with that program or that command that I just opened the drawing with. Just something to keep in mind. So what are some of the other advantages of Lisp? I think very important is if you write Lisp routines, a lot of the other CAD programs, if you've done a lot of Lisp routines, a lot of that will translate very well into DraftSight. In fact, I believe that 95 to almost 100% of those things that you've written before, it depends on the sequence of events and it depends on the commands and some of these options that you may or may not use. But for the most part, the way the program works and the way the language works is identical in almost all these CAD systems. So if you follow a certain methodology, and some of this stuff I'll point out to you in some of the later sessions, if you follow a certain methodology, there's no reason that the programs you write in DraftSight won't work in other programs and or vice versa. The other thing with Lisp is that it's platform independent, which means it does not matter what version of Windows this Lisp routine was written for. In fact, I've written things a couple decades ago on completely different platforms that work very well today in Windows 10 in DraftSight without a problem. And so you don't have to worry about writing something for a specific version of a certain operating system. Doesn't come into play with Lisp. Also, you do not have to compile the code. If you looked at that startup Lisp routine that I created, it wasn't compiled. It was just text that I put into a notepad file, and it's called an LSP file. I can use Notepad to edit that, and you load it and it runs automatically. You do not have to compile the code in Lisp. The other thing is that Lisp routines are extremely tiny, very small. We're talking kilobytes of size, not megabytes, but kilobytes of size for literally hundreds, if not thousands of lines of code. Because it doesn't require other libraries to be loaded or compiled or put in with your code, it's only simply text. So there's no real DLL libraries or things that you have to load up to really make these things heavy. They're very lightweight. There's also no limit to how long you or the depth of logic or how much data you can open and read with a Lisp program. So to give you an example, I've written Lisp routines that could open up basically Excel spreadsheets or data from Excel that Excel could not read. Literally millions of lines of data could be read with a Lisp routine that you cannot do with other programs. Also, there's no level to the depth of logic. So if I have if statements, I can have if statements go down levels, hundreds of levels deep, to get to a certain result that I need to have. So there's no limitation in terms of how long, how wide, how deep you can go with these programs. Like I said, I've written programs that have been 20, 30,000 lines of code with Lisp that I would not be able to do with other languages, depending on the sequence of events and what I'm trying to do. Now, while I told you you cannot take your Lisp routine and go beyond the current drawing, that doesn't mean you can't open up internal or external data and manipulate it. So I can open up external files and bring that information in, and I can create external files while I'm in that Lisp session. So I can do a lot of data and object manipulation within the Lisp routine. I also have a couple different editors that are available. I personally like Notepad++. I think I showed you that example, and I'll give you another example of it. It's a free editor. It works really well, and it allows you to, as you pick on your parentheses, you can see that the closing parenthesis will be highlighted. Something very useful. Also, your code in your commands and things can be color coded. Strings can be color coded different from numbers and so on. And so it's a really nice editor. It works really well. I've used it for many years, and I would highly recommend it if you're just getting started. And then in terms of online resources, there are literally tens of thousands of pages out there of resources for Lisp code. So if you go to Google and say, I want a Lisp routine that copies and rotates, most likely you'll be able to find one that's available out there that's maybe built for another CAD system, but most likely will work in DraftSight. So it's the resources that are available and the training sessions and classes that are out there, almost all of those things will apply to DraftSight. The biggest difference when looking at DraftSight versus some of the other CAD systems is some of the native commands, knowing which ones are there. But again, if you have an alias for that native command which relates to another CAD system, most likely your programs will work just fine. Now, I used this example. Earlier you saw that I created a fillet radius macro. And what does that look like as a Lisp routine? So very similar to our move copy. We have a defined function. We have the command. I'm going to do FH for fillet half millimeter. So FH is my alias. I don't have any variables to declare, so I'm going to do an open close parenthesis after this. And then here's my command. It's fillet radius 0.5. And then I have to repeat the fillet command because once I set the radius, it ends the command, and so I have to basically repeat the command to go back and actually do the fillet. So there it is, and then I have my little print C at the end, which cleans up the little nil statement that you would normally see if you don't have that little statement. And then there's that closing parenthesis. So that is a one-line Lisp routine simply to create a fillet for half a millimeter radius. What if I want to create more? Well, F0 for 0, F1 for 1, and F2 for 2. Very simple. If I take those and I add them to my startup menu and they look like this, simply again in Notepad, I put them in here. And if I'm using Notepad++, it's just going to look like this. Same sequence, it's just color coded. And again, I like this because if I wound up putting an extra M in my command, it would actually be a different color. So it's sort of a visual tool for me to see that my strings are good. This is a real number because it's showing up in red, and my print C and my command and my defun are spelled correctly because they're showing up in blue. So just an example. So what does that look like if we look at in DraftSight? So here I have it. If I type in F1, I've got my fillet 1 radius. So if I pick here, there's my F1. If I type F2, here's my F2. And if I type in FH for half, there's my half millimeter. So again, it's just now I have these aliases that I can use, very different from the alias commands because as you remember, we cannot add different different options or different command strings to an alias. It's just simply the fill command is F. But here I've got my macros that I've created or my aliases that I've created that are much more powerful. So now the other thing I can do is if I take this startup.lisp file and I put it on another computer and I put it in the support folders, I automatically have these shortcuts or these commands available to me on that machine. So I don't have to go in and modify the menu. I don't have to go and create different aliases or things like that. It's just simply put that file in the support folders and it automatically loads up and it's available. So another powerful thing that you can do with Lisp. Now, I hope that I've just sort of given you a tease about what things we're going to cover in the following sessions. Now, this was just simply an introduction to doing a little bit of Lisp, but in the upcoming sessions, we're going to talk about syntax, program structure, different types of function development. We're going to also go through different examples, many examples that I'm going to give you in terms of setting standards and layers, layer creation, different methodologies that might be even more efficient than the macros that I was showing you earlier, doing different things about data extraction and being able to write to external files and bringing that data in and out of drawings. Also, I talked about that sequence where we cannot go from one drawing to another, but I'm going to show you a methodology that you can use to create a file with a Lisp routine that will actually be able to take you into another drawing and do a sequence of events in that drawing. So that it is possible to do. It's just you have to do a certain method, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Also, I will talk about creating dialogue interfaces, different interfaces and how to create them. We'll do an introduction to that. And then we'll go over some best practices and things that throughout the course you'll find that if I find things that are coming from other CAD programs that are a little bit different in DraftSight, I try to point out those differences for you. Now, in the final session, I'm going to give you an example, and we've got a lot of requests for this. I'm going to give you an example of an automation to creating PDF files. So for instance, let's say that every time you save a drawing, you want it to go out and create all the PDFs of that drawing automatically of all your layout tabs. I'm going to show you an example of how to automate that entire sequence. In fact, if we look at DraftSight here, I'll show you an example. If I have this drawing and I've made a change, let's say for instance I got to make a change. In fact, we got to move this guy to be in this location because it's wrong. And I say, you know what, I want to save this drawing. I go up to save the drawing. You'll notice what I've done is I've captured the save command and said, hey, by the way, do you want to publish these PDFs of all your layouts? I've got all these layouts, and now that I've made a change, all those layouts have been updated. And if I say yes, it'll actually go out and create all those PDFs for me automatically. So, and notice that's the default, so I could just hit enter. Well, I'll show you how to build that and how to put it together and make that happen. And so you can set up your PDFs to do a specific paper size or whatever you need. I'll show you the whole sequence of how that's done and that interface and how to create that dialog box in the last session. And so hopefully that'll be a little teaser for you to consider. So what do we cover? We covered aliases, and now actually I think if you've seen menu commands and Lisp routines, you might consider that aliases aren't something you necessarily want to use unless you just need some simple commands, shortcuts for, or abbreviations for existing commands. But you'll also notice what we can do with the menu commands and what you can do in Lisp in terms of the startup, some menu macros and some things that you can do with that. And then also we went over some best practices. Make sure you back up and save your data profiles, your default profiles, create new profiles, save those things, put your files in a local drive that is accessible, like users public. It's a great place to put drawings because you have access to that in Windows, not a problem with security. And then also consider using the exclamation point as a way to make those files that you modify float to the top of the list, especially like in those, if there's certain files, drawings, or also in the case where we did the menu commands, having those come to the top of the list was much easier. Also, again, I would have you consider looking at your PGP files. If you're bringing those in from another CAD system, might be easier to build some things from scratch, maybe even making those aliases as small Lisp commands so that it's much easier to manage and all in one file, easy to manipulate. And so those are types of things that we'll cover in a future session. So if you look at the upcoming sessions, Again, like I said earlier, if you have never done any programming, you're not coming from another CAD system and you want to start doing some Lisp programming in DraftSight, you can start with session 3 and go through the rest. And maybe when you're done with session 7, you can go back to session 2 to go over some best practices. But if you're coming from another CAD system, you've done some of these things before, that might be a great place to start. And then session 3 through 7 might be just sort of um, it might be things that you've already seen or heard before. It might just be a reminder, but there might be some things that you can pick up in those sessions. All of them are less than an hour, so they're really very short, easy to go through. You can pause the sessions, and you should be able to also be able to follow along and do some things there. I'd really encourage you to be active on the forums if you have questions. There's plenty of people that are answering questions around DraftSight and Lisp programming and some of the menu modifications. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next couple videos. Take care.